Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity of speaking first after a cookie lunch and to have a chance to talk about the topic of food security and to do it in a way, I guess it's going to be a bit lecture-ish, but I think it needs to be put in proper context. 40 or 50 years ago, if we talked about food security, we'd talk about food security as being equivalent to self-sufficiency. A nation must feed itself. But thankfully, we've gone far beyond that because there are very few countries that would even have the capacity to feed themselves if they wanted to do so. Much more likely is the case that every country, and I challenge in my class students to tell me a country that is food self-sufficient. Every country is participating to some degree, some to a big degree, in terms of participating in the international market. So, I forgot to start my thing, sorry. Start out to say that food security, from the point of view of involvement in world markets, is an essential part of food security's involvement in world markets. So that's point number one that I wanted to make. And why is that the case? Well, it's not only the case because of the fact that it's not possible to produce bananas in northern Canada, but it's also more likely because of the concept of comparative advantage that we all know about, that you should do those things that you can do relatively better than somebody else and trade those for things that you do less well. And that goes back to an English economist named Ricardo. So, what do we mean by food security? And here I'm going to poach on FAO, and Dan, I hope I'm not taking your thunder. But I thought FAO's definition in 2003 of food security was really quite good. Food security exists when all people, at all times, have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And what that involves, then, is originally three, but four essential elements. First, the food's got to be available, the supply. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. It requires access, either by being ability to earn income, to buy food, or through other mechanisms such as safety nets to get access to the food. And it requires that it be nutritionally whole, to allow you to have a complete and healthy diet. And there's been a fourth one added, which is the stability of that supply. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about food security. I used to teach classes at the World Bank on how we at the bank should be thinking about food security. And I'd start those lectures by saying that it's, in my view, every country's obligation to assure that every citizen in that country is food secure. And that requires, in my view, a macroeconomic and social policy commitment to food security that is every bit as important as macro policies with respect to growth and development, with respect to fiscal balances, monetary policy, balance of payments policy. I think that's where food security has to be in terms of the firmament of importance. It must be comprehensive, and it must be pursued, I would argue, given that definition, at the presidential or prime ministerial level. Now, why do I argue that? Because I think over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen the results of not paying attention to a national food security policy in a period of crisis. In many countries, it was first and foremost a humanitarian crisis, but very quickly became a political crisis, and if left to fester, I would argue, could lead to social instability, as it did in some countries. Equally important is the fact that a poorly designed food security policy can put other macroeconomic policies at risk. Rising fiscal costs for production and feeding subsidies, inflationary pressures of rising food prices, drains on foreign exchange balances if you're importing the food supply. All of that in addition to having a devastating effect on the poor who spend more than 50% of their income on food. So I'm going to put a picture up there now, and don't get excited, but this is to say that I think we need to look at food security in a very comprehensive and a complete fashion. So let me disaggregate this a bit. The task is complex because we need to start by doing an assessment of what are the aggregate long-term consumption needs of a country. And that involves understanding what's happening in terms of population, growth rates, and location, what's been happening in terms of income, what are the conditions of poverty and hunger. Because out of that, you need to develop a picture, and that's the component part, of the demand, what I would call the demand side of the situation. That's your aggregate food needs assessment. You need then to add to that the reality that